You don't see pregnant women over 66 very often, but the physicians are certain that this is the case. There is something strange about the birth of the kid by the lady Karen Connolly, and after performing a few tests on the mother and infant, the medical professionals swiftly uncover a startling finding. If only they had been aware of this earlier. Karen and her husband thought all their difficulties were over when they were finally able to deliver their child. They may have been elderly, but they were this adorable boy's first parents. However, there was something they were still unaware of. Doctors find that they need to confirm something 3 times before they genuinely allow themselves to trust what they are seeing after doing more tests on Karen and the baby. But there's no denying it. The physicians inform Karen and George of the bad news, and upon hearing it, they are unable to help but weep. What, though, did the physicians find? And how on earth could a 66-year-old lady ever manage to conceive? Doctors were astonished to learn that the 66-year-old lady was pregnant. They often questioned how Karen, who was older than them, could be carrying a child in her womb. Even Karen herself was taken aback by the news, in addition to the doctor. Karen had gone to the hospital to complain about her long-lasting fatigue and nausea. She reasoned that maybe she had picked up a virus or something. But the moment the doctors told her she was expecting a kid, she was in for the biggest shock. She was 4 months pregnant, according to the test's results. Karen said that she had lately been more aware of her size. She didn't think much about it, however, since she blamed her weight increase on her retirement. She believed that the reason was that she hadn't been going to work, but had instead been spending most of her time at home recuperating and eating healthily. Although it wasn't impossible, it was uncommon for a woman Karen's age to get pregnant. The physicians immediately attempted to shift their attention after processing the shocking news. She caught the attention and concern of the medical professionals who wanted to make sure both mother and child were well. To ensure Karen's health and that of the developing baby, the hospital's medical personnel made the decision to do further tests on her. They discovered after doing a thorough examination that the mother and child were both doing well. They felt at ease after coming to this knowledge, but they didn't want to take any risks, so they made the decision to take some action. Karen was urged by the physicians to regularly visit the hospital up until the baby was born. They made it clear that they were committed to seeing to it that she and the child were healthy. While being taught, Karen was thinking about other things since she was unaware of the passionate physicians. Her mind was wandering, so she paid little heed to the physician's instructions. As she made her way back home from the hospital, Karen was deep in thought. She was preoccupied with trying to make sense of all that had occurred and the news she had received from the hospital until she finally went home in the afternoon. The realization that she was going to be a mother again confused her more than the realization of her own age. Although she was taken aback by the news, she was also filled with skepticism. She questioned whether or not she still had the stamina to carry and birth another kid. The more she pondered the matter, the more anxious she became. Karen and George, her husband, have been together for over 4 decades. They raised 3 lovely children, all of whom are now married and living on their own. Karen has 3 grandkids, so it's okay to call her a grandmother. Karen was completely taken aback by George's lack of disbelief once she broke the news to him. George said he reacted that way because he had an inkling that something wonderful and unexpected was about to enter their life. As for the wonderful thing, he said he just didn't know what it was yet. It seemed like George was totally on board with the idea of having children again. He said that raising their older kids was the most rewarding experience of his life, and that he wished he could do it all over again. However, Karen had lingering concerns about the child. She wasn't sure whether she should continue the pregnancy because of her concerns about its viability. Karen gave the situation a lot of thought before deciding to keep the baby. As a result of her children's perspective, she made up her mind quickly to keep the baby. When Karen told her kids about the pregnancy, they were astonished and reluctant to side with their dad, George. When it came down to it, they decided it was okay to retain it if it would make their parents pleased. As a result of having made that choice, Karen was resolved to accept whatever hardships her pregnancy would bring. The deadline was coming closer as the months passed. Karen's body suffered more throughout this pregnancy than during any of her others. On the worst days, she had a hard time even getting out of bed. George, being a kind guy, would constantly go out of his way to make his wife happy and comfortable. George was a gentleman by nature, but his recent behavior puzzled Karen. George went above and above for her, and she thought it was really out of character for him. Karen married George, a traditionalist who was wed to the idea that men and women should perform different duties in society. Karen approved of George's trait since she, too, adhered to traditional gender norms. Because of George's unexpected assistance, she started to fear that he was hiding something from her throughout her pregnancy. Karen couldn't help but wonder whether George was being so kind to her because of something she wasn't aware of. Karen first thought her hormones were to blame for her uncertainty about her marriage. With the passage of time, she became certain that she had been correct in her assumptions. Karen first felt the strain of bearing a baby at her advanced age at the precise 3-week mark before her due date. The severity of her illness at this point forced George to rush her to the hospital. He reasoned that she would be safer under the care of medical professionals. The unfortunate lady was immediately examined by a doctor upon arrival at the hospital due to the seriousness of her condition. Eventually, the doctor realized he had to deliver the baby right away. Karen's safety was prioritized, thus the baby was delivered right away. George was relieved that he had taken his wife to the hospital at the correct time. Karen's delivery took place the same day after a medical induction was performed. These measures were used to initiate labor for Karen, who was, at that point, quite frail. The physicians decided on an emergency C-section after seeing a new indicator of distress shortly after she was induced. However, it wasn't long before doctors determined that a cesarean section wasn't necessary. Karen had an all-natural birth after just a few minutes of labor. She struggled through it, but the doctors did their best to protect her from going into shock. She and the baby are alive and well, thank goodness. The physicians were relieved, but they had no idea that the bad news wasn't finished. Both Karen and her newborn needed another week in the hospital to make a full recovery. George, too, was there at all times. Yet, unlike other members of the group, he looked to be laser-focused on one path. The mother, at least, didn't seem to notice his presence at the hospital after the birth. During the week that Karen was allowed to recuperate in the hospital after giving birth, George paid her very little attention. The infant was his exclusive preoccupation, to the detriment of his relationship with his wife. Being preoccupied with her well-being, Karen paid little attention to his behavior. Without realizing it, she was making a critical error by not giving George's behavior any serious consideration. After just a week, Karen had had enough of the hospital and was finally discharged. She and George took the infant on a peaceful hour-long automobile ride. Karen enjoyed her time with George more now that they were alone together. This was the first alone time they'd had in a while, and she was thrilled to chat about becoming parents again. Karen tried to chat to George, but he didn't seem interested. She inquired as to his thoughts on being a father once again, and on his plans for the future with their new baby boy. She attempted to pique his attention, but he was not in the talking mood. It was starting to bother Karen, and it worried her too. What was George's problem? George's actions at the hospital may be disregarded. Since he had just become a father once again, he had good reason to feel emotional. In every way, This new chapter of life would be different. George needed time to acclimatize, but something had to be wrong now that they were on their way home, and he still wouldn't speak to her. Karen made the executive decision to put George's odd behavior on hold for the time being. Once she was released from the hospital, she felt a tremendous sense of relief. When they got home, their kids and other family members were there to welcome them and celebrate the new baby, but George was still behaving strangely. Everyone in the family was overjoyed to have a new member, but Karen especially adored her newborn niece or nephew. But George didn't appear to mind at all. He didn't give a damn about Karen or the rest of the family, or the newborn kid. He treated everyone there as if he were an outsider. Karen put up a brave front since she didn't want to create panic, but she was starting to grow nervous. At the hospital, George had spent a lot of time staring at their newborn son and not paying any attention to Karen. All of it seemed to have disappeared. Even when he was at home with his loved ones, he seemed unconcerned. George promptly passed the infant over to a family member and went in search of a drink after being given custody of the child. The longer this continued, the worse this conduct became. Karen was unsure whether she could bring up the subject with George. He'd been friendly for a while, but recently he simply looked distant. Where did he go, and why didn't he come back? Was he privy to information that Karen wasn't? Why do you think that is? While Karen was fretting about George at home, medical staff at the hospital were concerned about something else. Early that day, they had informed Karen that she was being returned home. She and the baby seemed to be in excellent health, so they weren't worried about them. With the test results in hand, though, they realized they had to call them back. Even after Karen had gone, there were still unanswered quizzes. The hospital had released them, anticipating negative test results. Because, after all, both she and the baby had been healthy and robust upon discharge from the hospital. Where did we go wrong? When the test results came back, the physicians were more than a little taken aback. Tests were repeated twice more to ensure accuracy of findings. They doubled down on making sure they had the appropriate samples and that the tests had gone off without a hitch, and still got the same result. 3 sets of testing confirmed that Karen and her family needed to return to the hospital. They realized they required Karen and George's prompt return and made the call. They needed to hear it from someone in person. What could possibly be such stunning news, though? Karen was exhausted by the time the family finally departed her house. She and George had just put the baby to bed and were doing some cleanup after the party. Right then, the phone rang. Karen answered it, thinking it was another family member phoning to offer their congratulations. Nonetheless, it wasn't a member of the family. The true terror lay in something else entirely. She knew something was awry as soon as she saw that it was the hospital phoning. No one from the hospital would be phoning to see how you were doing just yet. They had just recently returned home. George realized it was the hospital phoning, and he immediately became tense. He had anticipated a call like this one. Karen was instructed to return to the hospital with George and the newborn early the next morning. After conducting a battery of tests, they reported to Karen that they had discovered something worrying. Karen's heart was broken. George's reaction was unexpected, but they wouldn't tell her over the phone what it was. In a conversation with Karen, George said that he had a theory about what this may be. Karen was already anxious about it, and he didn't want to bring it up until they heard the findings. According to him, it would be unfair to her. Karen, however, could not sleep for fear of that very notion. She hoped beyond hope that the findings would reveal nothing bad, but it didn't seem like that was going to happen. Much had changed on the way back to the hospital from the day before. Karen was anxious, but George was cool under pressure. As well as himself, He was attempting to maintain Karen's composure. He predicted that Karen and the baby would be okay if the test results matched his expectations. Karen, though, was still anxious. Even after venting to George in the vehicle, Karen didn't feel any better. Because of what he said, her worries multiplied, and she couldn't get her mind off of it. She was so anxious that she couldn't even hold the baby when they arrived at the doctor's office. George picked up the infant and urged Karen to cool down again. The doctor certainly seemed to be uneasy. He obviously doesn't want to break the news and is overcome with anxiety. The doctor spent too much time describing the tests and not enough getting to the crux of the matter. He repeatedly sidestepped the genuine problem, but in the end, the couple found out that the DNA testing had been concerning. The doctor reassured Karen that she and the baby were healthy while explaining the results of the tests they had performed. George was the source of the issue. George seemed to understand what the doctor was saying as he nodded his head in agreement. Why weren't they filling her in on this? It had been shown by several DNA testing that George was not the father of the child. The infant, he was told, was his kid didn't have his father's DNA. This time, Karen didn't come out on top. Immediately, she understood what had taken place and that her life was going to be flipped upside down. Karen fought back tears, but it was obvious from her husband's expression that he had known about her affair for some time. Before the infant was even born, he already knew. Even though he had a sneaking suspicion the kid wasn't his, he kept quiet since he knew a new child would make Karen happy. There was more, however. All during her pregnancy, George was there for Karen and treated her with nothing but kindness and love. The possibility that it was his child remained a source of hope for him. He was confident Karen couldn't have conceived their child with anyone else, but after the birth, he realized he wasn't the father. What his instincts told him to be true, he discovered to be so. While trying to form a relationship with the infant, he conducted a thorough examination of the infant. You can tell the infant doesn't look like him because hair and eyes that didn't quite go with either him or Karen. He knew the kid wasn't biologically his, but he'd been quiet about it because he wanted Karen to be happy. But now it was Karen's turn to share her thoughts. Karen ultimately told her boyfriend his identity, and they were able to have a conversation. Both he and George planned to play an active role in the infant's upbringing. Every one of them had earned it, and they knew it. George chose to remain with Karen regardless of whether or not she was pregnant with his child. His only motivation was to make her happy. Something had to give in their family dynamic. Karen had to break the news to her grown children that George was not the father of the kid. George calmed everyone down by repeating that he simply wanted Karen to be happy, and after a while, everyone was able to get over their initial astonishment and anger. And in the end, everyone got along well.